We'll get started this morning. Hello and welcome everyone to an AMO Energy Champions webinar. I'm Jeff Lehman. I'm the Mayor of the City of Barrie and I chair AMO's Energy Task Force. Very glad you can join us. We're going to spend about another hour or so, the next hour or so, talking about municipal conservation demand management, or CDM, as just about everybody knows it. So joining me today are Alex Chapman, who's Manager of Climate Change in the City of Guelph, and Alan Kirschbaum, Senior Policy Advisor, Conservation Programs and Partnership at the Ministry of Energy. What we're going to do is cover a fairly wide range of topics here, from what each municipal government can do and is required to do to make CDM really meaningful for your municipality. Just before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. All attendees will remain muted during the course of the webinar. If you do have questions, though, please use the chat box in Zoom. If you type them into the chat box in the Zoom control panel, we'll be able to see those and address them during the course of the webinar. The chat bubbles at the central part of the bottom of your screen there on the control panel. And the questions should appear over on the right-hand side when they're sent. So we will try and address those during the presentation. And of course, we're recording this session as well, and AMO hopes to make this available on the website in a couple of weeks after we're concluded. So to start off, we're gonna have Alan share a couple of slides that really sort of touch on the essentials for municipal governments in terms of meeting CDM requirements. And then from there, the three of us will spend some time talking about how to make this tool more than just ticking the boxes, but really a value add as well for you, from using standards to catalyze other benefits in the community to projects that really can have an impact. So we'll take a look at some of the barriers, some of the tools to help make this more meaningful. So Alan, I'm going to hand it off to you at this point to start with the municipal requirements. Alan.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm just going to give some background on the broader public sector energy reporting regulation, specifically on the update of the conservation demand management plans. The regulation was developed a few years ago to help municipalities better understand where and how they use their energy. We have 5 years of data on the open data website, and organizations, municipalities have already developed their first plans in 2015. As a reminder, the annual energy reports need to be submitted to the Ministry of Energy and posted on your organization's websites. Ensures transparency in terms of the energy used by those organizations. I should point out that it's not just municipalities, it's also school boards, hospitals, post-secondary institutions that also report annually develop conservation demand management plans. This conservation demand management plan, we just call them CDM plans. They need to be posted on your website and also available in hard copy. Support for the regulations has been very strong over the years. We're currently in our 6th year of reporting. Last year, 99% of organizations submitted their annual energy report to the ministry. And in 2014, we had links for 82% of the plans across the broader public sector. We did a review of the first plans, and understandably they were the first plans, and there were some shortcomings. Less than 20% met all the requirements. And the requirements, at a high level, were proposed measures, goals and objectives, anticipated outcomes, and things like ensuring that senior management signed off. Most of the organization focused on technical requirements for a plan, so it was more retrofits than behavioral change or things like setting up routines in your organization. Municipalities didn't really use energy benchmarks. We had them at the the operation level is defined in the regulation. So there wasn't a lot of use of that. And 30% of the organizations didn't know how they would track progress in terms of achieving their goals and objectives. And the CDM plans, they're really meant to be a continuous improvement or living document approach to saving energy and actually also reducing your greenhouse gas emissions. And they're meant to be a tool for your organization to help you achieve your objectives. And lastly, you've heard this many times, but if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So the annual energy reporting exercise is actually very, very valuable. The review did uncover some best practices, things like using energy benchmarks, making sure your plans were easy to understand for the public and also for your employees. And also developing a table or a series of tables that outline what the proposed projects were, who's going to be working on them, when they would occur, and also the incentives if there were any available alongside with that. The regulation doesn't ask you to report on water consumption in your buildings, but some of the better plans went beyond the basic requirements of the plans. Again, as I mentioned, and I'm going to be mentioning this a few times this morning, it's also considering behavioral and organizational changes along with your technical ones. There's also the opportunity to work with others in your sector, so neighboring municipalities or organizations within yours to help develop a coordinated CDM plan. And something that's very critical is a CDM plan is not a standalone document. It should and can be linked to other planning requirements such as capital plans or infrastructure plans. And as I mentioned before, the plan should be a document. It's not something that you update once every 5 years. Best practice is to consider a living document and update it throughout the 5 years. It's a situation where even technologies change. I would think that when the first plans were drafted, nobody anticipated how street lights would take off. So, there's other technologies out there that could cause you to revisit your plan during the next 5 years. And a critical one is to ensure that senior management is supportive and that they demonstrate that to staff and the public. So the requirements for the update is they need to be done by 2019. They, again, should also link to other municipal drivers, cost savings, greenhouse gas emission reductions. The requirements are laid out in Section 6 of the regulation. So there are the initial requirements to develop goals and objectives and proposed measures. But also in the update, you need to describe the current proposed measures that you'll be doing to achieve your results, revised forecast and expected results from the proposed measures, reporting what you actually achieved over the first 5 years in your first plan. And the last one, a very important one, is describing how you are going to make any changes to help you achieve your objectives. A couple of links. Organizations, municipalities were sent the web portal link. The portal is active. And also, if you have any questions on how to submit your reports or CDM plan requirements, if you send those to bpssupport.ontario.ca, we monitor that email address throughout the day and try to get back to you the same day. And we're just figuring out the
So what's next?
Yeah, sorry, Kathy. Do we have a deck next?
No, it's now conversation time.
Okay, my apologies. I thought we had a few more slides yet to go. Okay, so for those present, what we wanted to do at this point was have some discussion around how CDM can really have an impact in various municipalities. And, you know, I think one of the things we wanted to say right off the top is this, like so many other things that we do in our sector, is not a one-size-fits-all. Far from it. Our capacity at municipalities varies so widely. Our opportunities as municipalities vary so widely. So, you know, really, as you tackle this issue and as we look at these requirements, what we're hoping to do today is obviously highlight a few practices, but also recognize that there are some basics that most municipalities may be able to undertake internally or with a little bit of assistance, and then advancing that to higher levels can be something that involves community energy planning outside resources or otherwise. And certainly Alex has been a thought leader and an industry leader in this. And Alex, I think maybe I'll hand it off to you at this point, just to give us thoughts and experience from Guelph in terms of what you've already been doing in conservation plan management.
Thanks, Jeff. I think the first thing that I would point out is that our CDM planning in Guelph at the corporate level has always been very closely aligned with our community energy planning efforts. So Guelph was the first community in Canada to create a community energy plan back in 2007. And really the city determined that we needed to lead by example in our leading our community by creating our own energy management plan. So in 2012, that's what we did. And it was passed by council in October that year. And then in 2013, we started actually implementing it. So we were a little bit ahead of the curve there. And we created our plan before the requirements from the ministry came out. So we had to do just minor adjustments really to make it fit the requirements of the regulation, principally around reporting on actual renewable energy generation, and also making sure that it was available on our website. It was in council agenda minutes and not particularly easy to find, so we created a webpage dedicated to energy, and we provided links to the relevant documents there. So that was really where we started. So really making sure our corporate efforts were aligned with our community efforts, and the city was leading by example. Since then, we found a lot of value in the opportunity to not just comply with what the ministry requires, but to take the whole arc of the story from creating our original plan and gathering the data and really trying to use that as an opportunity to drive value for the corporation. And I'll give you an example of that. So the effort involved in preparing our first submission to the ministry was very, very high. And that was because we were having to go through all the bills and input them into a spreadsheet and do all this work to just get a fix on what our energy usage was. And of course, as is often the case, we paused for a second and said, there's got to be an easier way to do this. So we started casting around for what our options were. And we learned that an energy management system where either ourselves or some third party would input that bill data was a preferable way to go. So we eventually signed on to a third party, contracted with them to do that work for us. And what we realized when we did that was not only did it make it easier to submit our reports every year, but it actually gave us up to the minute, or at least up to the month, information on how we were doing. And that started driving some new conversations around talking to individual departments and saying, oh, how are you doing? We're able to zero in on the departments that were most energy consuming. We're also able to some extent to take a look at the data that's in the broader public sector portal and compare how we're doing. Not particularly easy to do that, so there were programs like the Mayor's Megawatt Challenge that allowed us to do that a little bit more simply. And I think that the data that was available online was a catalyst to making that program particularly helpful with the Fire Hall Challenge, the City Hall Challenge, the Community Center Challenge, and those kinds of things, where we're zeroing in on a particular type of building and really comparing as a city how we're doing to comparable cities and comparable facilities. So I think that the ministry regulation was really a fire starter to get us moving with some of that activity and to really learn how we're doing and how we compare.
And I'd certainly echo that. One of the things that we undertook here was we played our, creating a little friendly rivalry never hurts, and whether that's among departments or among facilities or otherwise, we had a challenge we've got 3 large community centers, challenged each of them to look at all of their operations and their energy consumption, and came up with an award in a contest last year. And maybe both of you can speak a little bit more about the kinds of projects, now getting a little more granular, that you see. I think many will be familiar with what's always called the low-hanging fruit, swapping out light bulbs for more energy efficient lighting, looking at building controls and potentially heating systems and energy consumption around ring heating and so forth. But one of the things I've been noticing, we've started to see through the LDCs as well, is as this field has become more mature, as the ministry has changed and the level of a kind of reporting and so forth, people are going a little bit deeper into their organizations to try and understand maybe what the next round of opportunities is. And maybe, I'll start with you, Alan, in terms of what the ministry might be seeing in terms of, we've had sort of several years of this now, and probably the early and obvious things in many cases have been tackled. What are some of the newer things you're starting to see?
Well, so a lot of the newer things, as you mentioned, have to do with building automation systems. It's a good investment in terms of making sure that you have the controls in place. But just having the controls in place doesn't necessarily mean that over time that system will serve you. I've participated in webinars where they were talking. This thing was hundreds of set points in a building that were all in overload. So it's important to, if you're going to have a building automation system, to make sure that all the set points are actually where you want them to be on an ongoing basis. Also, there's been huge changes in terms of still opportunities for converting street lighting to LED street lighting. I believe even the LAS has a program. There's probably 170 or 180 municipalities that have signed on. There's still a huge opportunity for Ontario's municipalities to get into that program. I believe street lighting accounts for 15% of municipalities' electricity use, so there's a huge opportunity there. So even in buildings where initially you've converted to more efficient fluorescent lighting, there's an opportunity to LED lighting in those cases as well. But one of the big opportunities is training, and it's training in terms of operations staff, so that they can operate their existing equipment more efficiently and effectively, and also to have some behavioral programs which can be maintained in terms of lighting programs, or hospitals use various speed fans in their labs, and actually make those savings sustainable by keeping the profile of that up in the organization.
I think in the case of the City of Guelph, when we prepared our CDM plan, it was in lockstep with energy audits we performed on our largest tax-supported facilities. So I guess what I would speak to as far as what we learned from that, and maybe what was missing, the sorts of retrofits that we saw coming out, or recommendations for retrofits that we saw coming out of those audit reports, were moving to more efficient lighting, although that was back in 2012, so you can imagine that LEDs weren't seeing the sort of economic returns that they're seeing today. So the audit reports originally proposed moving to high bay fluorescence and even induction lighting in a few cases, and wasn't really particularly enthusiastic about LEDs. So that was one technological advance that we've seen in the interim, and although the original audit reports didn't recommend it, as we move forward, say the first retrofit project that we did stuck with the original recommendations and implemented that, but then subsequent ones, we looked more closely at what was available on the market and adapted our plans based on dramatic advances we're seeing in the cost effectiveness of LEDs. If I were to kind of expand then and say, well, first of all, we focused on tax supported facilities. So There were some facilities that were included in that, like our water and wastewater services and our solid waste management area, where there are significant opportunities. But then there's also certain things that were left out of scope that could have been included, and now we're starting to think over how we might do that. One of those was building exterior lighting. That wasn't originally in the scope of our audits, and now we're taking a close look at that because the same sort of savings you can see with converting over to LED streetlights, you can see with parking lot lighting and wall packs on buildings and that sort of thing. And then if we also look at, there's an interesting side conversation that has arisen partly as a result of the funding that's available from the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change with the GHG Challenge Fund. Where can we find the projects that have good economics but have significant carbon reduction impacts? And those two don't necessarily go hand in hand. So it's a bit of a challenge to go down the project list and say, okay, well, where do we see some really good and attractive carbon reductions where there's also good economics? Because natural gas is still pretty cheap, even with the carbon price that arises out of the cap and trade system. Sometimes it's difficult to find those. The other thing that's a bit difficult is when people have gotten now adjusted in our conversations with department managers to look for the electricity savings. We have to, first of all, kind of re-educate them and explain that, well, electricity savings do have good economics. They're not going to get us external funding because the electrical system is largely carbon-free now, or very low carbon anyway. And if we're looking for carbon reductions, then where we're going to find it is in space and domestic hot water heating, where natural gas is the technology of choice, or transportation fuels. So that's where we're taking another look. And also, again, because our original audits focused on facilities, there were some areas that were missed. We didn't look at vehicle fuels at all, and we didn't look at street lighting because that was a completely separate account area. So now we're looking at those areas, we're looking for opportunities in those areas, and there's lots of exciting stuff happening in that area. And we recently announced one particular opportunity that now has received funding from the province through the GHG Challenge Fund is digester gas storage at our wastewater treatment plant. So we had a bit of a mismatch between the amount of digester gas that our anaerobic digesters were producing and the amount that we could actually burn in our combined heat and power plant. So we would sometimes overproduce our digester gas, or we would have our combined heat and power plant offline for repairs or maintenance, and we would just have to flare that gas. We couldn't do anything with it. And conversely, we had times where the digesters weren't producing as much, and to keep our cogens running at full capacity, we'd have to use fossil natural gas from the grid. By putting storage in the middle, we were able to balance out the production of natural gas, or production of renewable natural gas on the one side with the consumption in our generation plant. So there's been some exciting changes along those lines, things that we never really envisioned when we did our original plan back in 2014, but things that are because we've already pretty much delivered on the retrofits that were in our original audit program, we can start exploring. And because of things like solving the problem of financing and having an internal revolving fund to pay for these projects, and then just developing that mindset of talking to departmental heads and finance and all the other stakeholders and getting them aligned around the idea of energy efficiency as being a project that, or an opportunity that doesn't just require capital funding and then that's the end of the story, but it's actually an investment that has a return. And that's relatively new thinking in a lot of our investment opportunities in the city.
I appreciate that that thinking for sure. I mean, we've been talking a little bit about, and of course this is a Champions webinar, the importance of, in a way, that cultural piece. And I think, Alan, you touched on that at the end of what your remarks just a minute ago as well. You know, there's a sort of mainstreaming of the role of energy management that has gone on in my experience over the last 3 or 4 years. We have a full-time energy manager. He actually has somebody who works for him. And I often say that the return on investment to create that mighty department of 2 could not be any greater. The impacts they've had, I mean, I won't go through our numbers, but we've essentially kept our hydro costs flat through the last 3 years, despite the massive increase in the price of hydro. And that's been through both early stage and later stage adoption of newer technologies. But I do want to spend a little bit of time on this cultural piece, or this idea of championing, because, you know, Alex, you just talked about how you talked to your council about this, and how we talk about this within our organizations, to see it as something that has an ROI, both in terms of its environmental and sustainability impact, and very directly in terms of its financial impact. But I think the organizational piece that, Alan, you were talking about at the end, where you know, as you shift forward from doing the initial capital projects into sort of more of an operational focus and a way of thinking, and, you know, ultimately you want a culture where energy reduction and conservation floats right out of frontline department, where staff see those opportunities and are able to bring them forward. Are there examples that you would point to of that kind of a culture where organizations, municipalities have either put in a model that you've seen be very effective? I know it is a common practice now in larger organizations to have those energy management functions, sometimes part of a facilities group, sometimes part of an independent or separate group or special projects group. But is there an approach to this that you have seen that's been particularly effective in creating that culture? Well, and I'll ask this question to both of you in terms of the culture of championing conservation and demand management.
Start on.
Yeah, sure. There's a number of municipalities that have moved their energy area into their finance department, so that you know, the development business cases is much stronger, and it's actually considered to be part of the budgetary process. And I think also just the creation of teams where you have people from across the organization. So you've got a facility person, a person in the admin area, a person in the budget area also has very strong results. But it's something that, you know, isn't just for large municipalities. You know, it's important that in a small municipality, even if you have fewer resources, that you bring these people together, because you do make the connection between asset management and costs and benefits. And something that we run into every year is staff turnover and how to deal with that. You know, one of the things we're a month or so into annual reporting this year, and every year there's about 20% or so turnover in organizations. So, you know, having a team approach also cements that. But there are also municipalities that Alex had mentioned, Guelph is doing it, where, you know, the City of Toronto and others have set up revolving funds. So they take a portion of all of their savings and have that dedicated towards ongoing energy conservation initiatives. And it's something that they do also in other sectors. So even in the university sector, Western Ontario uses that approach where they have a revolving fund, and the facilities person is actually an accounting person, so that he can speak the language on the business end. It's very important.
I think one thing I would point to in Guelph that has been a cultural change that has helped facilitate better energy management is we created a group called the Energy, Water, and Climate Change Working Group, or EWOC for short. So anybody who's a fan of Star Wars will recognize that reference. I still think that the admin assistant that came up with that deserves a medal. We've since renamed it the much more humdrum and prosaic Sustainability Board, which also has way more syllables, so I'm not as much of a fan of it. It's more descriptive of what we do. Guelph is a town where sustainability, it's not like we have to completely change the direction of the organization to incorporate sustainability to what we do. In fact, our story of sustainability goes back to the early 1990s with the creation of our Green Plan. And it's always been, as long as I've been at the city, it's been woven into the DNA of everything we do. Our challenge has been less getting people into a sustainability mindset, so much as getting people all pointed in the same direction and well coordinated. So really that's what our sustainability board does. And so we will have conversations about, for example, a new funding opportunity that comes down from the provincial or federal government. We will look down our capital project list and determine which projects on that list are best aligned with the criteria for that funding opportunity. And then we'll work together to create the applications for those funding opportunities. So I think that's a big difference. And then the other thing is, just because we're meeting on a regular basis, I think that it creates a sort of it allows more sensitive antennae to be out there sensing for opportunities out there in the organization. So more eyes and ears are out there looking to see what opportunities there are. They're more attuned to look for opportunities like GHG reductions, like electricity reductions, and even starting to look at things like demand changes. That's probably the most difficult thing for the layperson to understand is how it can be that you can save a whole lot of money just by reducing your peak load on the grid. And so we've had some conversations with companies that are offering, for example, battery technology as a way to implement that kind of saving. We haven't implemented it yet, but we're bringing people around to the idea that that's a viable opportunity, and not just because of a current rate structure in the way that our bills are currently configured, because that gives people some anxiety if we're making a massive investment based on a current rate structure that could be changed in relatively short order. People aren't really enthusiastic about that. Whereas if you have something that's rooted in economics, like for example, the fact that we pay more for electricity during the day because there's more demand for it, and at night it's cheaper. That's just supply and demand. Anybody that's taken an economic course understands that. That's a fundamental reality, whereas rate structures aren't. So when we have a conversation with people, when we're talking about economics, they get it. Whereas if we talk about rate structures and the way that our bills are constructed, they tend to be a little bit less enthused about it. So I think that having an organization like that, having our sustainability board, has achieved a number of things to create a culture of conservation, a culture of efficiency, and a culture of looking for the opportunities. It's one other selfish thing I'll point to is that as we have gotten more people around the table having conversations about conservation, about efficiency, and about carbon reductions, we've been able to identify some folks who are very enthusiastic about this and are maybe in a department that where their skills and their enthusiasm, their passion aren't producing the sorts of results that they would like to see. So we might be able to kind of scoop them for a second mentor, maybe even a full-time role as we grow our department. So there's a bit of poaching, I think, that can happen when we find people in the organization that have got that passion.
Well, and generating that passion too, there's a lot of internal efforts that can be made to recognize the champions, recognize the processes. I mean, we at the city of Barrie as well, of course, have had the opportunity to bring some of these successes to council. And I mean, the great stories that emerge here, and Alex, you just touched on this, is while you're doing CDM, of course you're looking for energy savings to move the needle on both dollars and consumption. But it is an opportunity to be looking at process reengineering. And yes, that slides into the slope of, are we now reviewing something broader than just how much gas or electricity we're using as part of our processes. But it can be a tool. I think conservation, demand management, and the agenda of energy savings can be used as a tool to really instigate some of the process reengineering that can go on across organizations. And I mean, our departments, particularly those with high energy consumption, the rate-based budgets, water and wastewater in particular, recreation, fleet, have really taken the opportunity to look at their energy use, but also more broadly look at their strategy within the individual department. So Alan, I mean, that's well and good for Alex and I, who are cities with full-time energy management staff and functions and capacity. I guess one of the things that many are interested in is, if you're smaller, if you have less of that internal capacity, what would best practice be? I mean, there are external resources that can help, but in terms of the smaller municipalities that report in and are succeeding in their plans, is there specific advice that you'd give them?
Well, some of the best practices, again, is to look at the benchmarks. We are going to be developing benchmarks at the operational level so that you can look at what a library would be using. So there are tools out there you have. They'll have at least 6 or 7 years of data at that point to look at. But a best practice is, as I said before, it's not just looking at this as a standalone document. It's considering it in comparison and aligning it with your asset management plans, your capital plans. So have to look at the broader municipality and consider growth, consider active development, consider transportation. Plans were part of the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change's municipal GHG Challenge Fund. There were requirements along the line of you've been involved, have you met all the requirements of your annual energy reporting. But I think it goes back to a plan needs to have some goals to it, and it doesn't matter if you are going to be changing your HVAC in the building or changing your street lighting. It's having it laid out in a plan in terms of tables, as I mentioned before. Who's responsible for prioritizing what's going to happen? Is there funding available from your LDC? Is there funding available from your natural gas utility? It's working with those organizations as well in terms of finding out what new proposals are and how they want to current programming. So from our perspective, it's more of how you approach the plan and developing it. But I'll take a step back. A few years ago, when the first plans were done, the municipality contacted us and they said, "We have 3 buildings. What can a plan be?" They said, "So what's your capital plan over the next few years?" We're going to be expanding our fire hall. Part of that will be putting in insulation in the whole fire hall. And I said, ta-da. So it doesn't have to be something in every single building. It doesn't have to be changing out equipment that still has a good long life to it. It's what are we doing? If we're on the roof, what can we do? If we're expanding the fire hall, what can we do? But also looking at not just the retrofit, but the behavior and the organizational changes as well. Looking at the loads and that cost changes.
Great, excellent. Sorry, Alex, I'll come right back to you. I just wanted to remind everybody who's on the webinar here, we do have about 50 people on, and if you have a question for any of the 3 of us, please do just stick that into the chat window, use the chat window, and send us your questions. We'll try and address it as we go here. So, Alex.
Yeah, Kathy actually handed me a question. Before I address that, I just will put in a plug for our Municipal Energy Managers Community Practice. So this is a combination of a Google group, which is an online forum for asking questions and getting answers, as well as occasional in-person meetings where we can get together and dive deep into particular topics, and then occasional webinars on particular topics as well. I would encourage anyone on the line who's from a rather small municipality where maybe you aren't able to justify a full-time energy manager position, to consider whoever it is that is dealing with energy management matters in your municipality, to just go ahead and join this group. We don't require our participants to make a contribution. It doesn't detract from the quality of our conversation or the amount of effort we have to put in. If people are on the sidelines, just listening to the conversation and getting good ideas from it. So for example, if a particular municipality has implemented a technology that allows you to use cold water for flooding your ice with your Zambonis and has had success with that, you can get the story on that. And you can learn what was done and how they achieved that success. And you you can ask the question, absolutely, but we're not requiring you to participate in the answers as well. So there's a real opportunity for you to jump in. And if you're interested, you can email me directly, or actually for now, just at the end of the webinar, I'll ask Kathy to send around my contact information, and I can send you a link for how to join. So then part 2 is the question that was posted. I'm not sure who asked it, but the question is about when Guelph did retrofits, did we look at insulation, and what standard did we use? Was it passive or OPC? The short answer is we did not look at the building envelope at all. So all we looked at were primarily the things within the building that were consuming energy directly. So we looked at lighting, we looked at HVAC, we looked at ice plant in our arena facilities, and so forth. So this is a big opportunity for us now to look at those aspects of our buildings and to incorporate higher standards into what we do. Now, I will say that in the midst of our efforts to retrofit specific buildings, we also had a couple of major renovations happening. One was with the Victoria Road Recreation Center, and one was with our police headquarters. So we were able to incorporate higher energy efficiency measures and standards into the rebuilds of those areas. And then I'll point to a couple of other facilities, our Clare Road Emergency Services Center, which is a new build, and then our Guelph Civic Museum, which was a renovation. We achieved LEED Silver status for both of those facilities. We're discussing going above and beyond code, and we are discussing the opportunity of moving to the passive hood standard, but we haven't actually formalized that yet.
You know, you just hit on something too there, Alex. I think there's when we talk about the low-hanging fruit or the initial round, before you get to building envelope, we look at everything that consumes energy within a building. The other thing I think that often gets missed is any engine, and engines don't just exist in your fleet. Our water department, one of our biggest success stories so far, in dollar terms, relatively modest, about $55,000 a year of electricity saving. But really as a pilot project for something that we hope to do on a much more broader scale, was for some variable rate motors on water pumps, rather than the sort of always-on technology that we've had in the past. These are variable frequency drive motors that we installed onto our municipal water pumps. There was a degree of incentive there, but I think even without the incentive, the return on this by memory was about a 5 or 6 year ROI, and with the incentive about a 3-year ROI. But that technology, I mean, this is something that actually can operate on a variety of equipment, municipal equipment, in a variety of different facilities and circumstances. So this is something that now, as you do a pilot, get some sense of whether or not the technology is manageable, what are the maintenance impacts, what are the operational impacts, and I think that builds some confidence to be able to replicate that in other comparable or similar circumstances. I guess one of the questions, though, as you get into the building envelope issue, which is maybe, we'll call it the second or third tier kind of opportunities. Insulation is a piece, obviously building controls are a piece, but and Alex, you just touched on this too, the choice that you make with a capital project to go to a LEED Silver or to integrate other potentially premium elements at the capital phase of the project that have an ROI. And actually, I'll go back to you, Alex, a little bit just to talk about that, because that's something that I have a good deal of experience sitting on the council side of that decision. When a project is brought forward, naturally, there's a desire to keep the ticket price down, to not necessarily introduce premium pieces purely for architectural reasons that can often get shot at from a political perspective. But when it comes with an energy benefit and frankly a business case that sits behind that, it becomes a little bit of a different ask to a city council. As you brought those projects forward, and I'm sort of being selfish here because there's one I'll talk about when you're done, but when you're making those pitches to an elected body and through it to our residents, there's a long-term return, but talk about how we say to our councils, lead is important. Spending some of these dollars up front is important.
Well, I think that the short answer is it makes economic sense. So as a community, when we're getting excited, for example, about finally moving ahead with the South End Community Center, South End Recreation Center,
Sure.
which is a big deal in Guelph right now. If we walk into the conversation, we say, oh, by the way, we understand that you're probably making certain assumptions about the operating cost of this building. We can offer some solutions that will help drive that operating cost down. And it's not just utility costs, because, for example, if at the outset we're incorporating current thinking about rainwater harvesting and grey water recovery and hot water circulation systems that ensure that when you put your hands under the tap, you're getting hot water right from the outset, rather than waiting for it to make its way through a couple hundred feet of piping before it's finally hot when it arrives at the tap. These sorts of technologies, when they're baked into the design, they're way cheaper than if you try and add them a couple of years down the road after the building's already been in operation. And when we can offer that as a direct benefit, a direct economic benefit, and we can point to, yes, it'll increase the cost by the building, the capital cost by an incremental amount, but you'll get more than your money back, or you'll get your money back within 3 to 5 years as a result of the savings you yield. Then that changes the conversation. And when the economic or the finance folks are at the table, they're looking for that sort of thing. I'll also point to where there's another dimension of the conversation where if you present your business case strictly in economic terms, that will get you a certain distance. But when you're talking to elected representatives, there's a couple of other areas where there's opportunities to expand your business case. One is anticipating the sort of concerns or objections that might come from the public and addressing those and baking that into the staff report recommending a certain opportunity. And the other is thinking about where are there opportunities, and this touches on, I think, Alan's comment about BAS opportunities. Where is there the chance to be a little bit more visionary and anticipate where we can take a slightly different approach, maybe a little bit more of investment, but expand what we're going to be able to do further down the road with what we're deploying. And I'll point to our street letting business case as an example of this. So on the one hand, we presented a very rock solid business case for the dollar savings for our retrofit with LEDs. But we also talked about what building in wireless adaptive controls would do for us. And frankly, the business case was not as strong for that element of the technology. But what we put out there was, okay, there's opportunities for aligning the actual output of the LEDs with what the photometric analysis actually says you need on a particular street. So you're not confined to, okay, a 70 watt fixture equivalent here, a 100 watt fixture over there, and well, on this particular street, maybe you need 72 watts.
Right.
Well, the manufacturer doesn't make a 72 watt fixture, they make a 70 or 100, and you can't underlight, so you're risking liability there. So you have to go with a 100 watt fixture. If you can use adaptive dimming to bring yourself from the 100 watts down to 72, you still met the requirement, you're actually saving energy. You're also going to have a fixture that's going to last longer, right, because its longevity is proportional to how much light it puts out. And then you can also start doing some clever things like turning the lights on later at night, because photometrically you don't need the lights to come on as soon as they do, and turning them off earlier in the morning. And then maybe notching out the middle of the night when traffic rates are low, you can get some additional savings there. Although we're not talking about dollar value that is comparable to the dollar value savings from switching over to LEDs, there's enough there on the table that we can then start having a conversation about there's additional technical opportunities that having that wireless network brings us. It brings us the opportunity to start maybe even introducing motion sensing technology to kind of have the lights on only when they're necessary. Maybe we can use that motion sensing technology to integrate with our traffic signaling so that we can cycle the signal so that by the time a vehicle arrives at the intersection, the light has already changed, instead of having to land on the induction loop at the intersection and sit and wait for the traffic signal to recognize that you're there, and then cycle it, and then finally you get to go through. So that sort of just kind of doing a bit of vision casting in the midst of the conversation can be very, very helpful. And it can take can go beyond just the straight economics of the conversation. And then finally, also, Guelph being having a reputation for being a particularly environmentally aware community, we also had to anticipate what are the sorts of objections that some of the more environmentally aware people in our city might bring. So there were really three that we talked about with the street lighting opportunity. One was the environmental impact of night lighting in the night environment, and how can we minimize that with this change. The second was the night sky viewing for amateur astronomers, which is actually a big deal for some folks in the city. And then the third is the impact on public health. So we were able to anticipate these types of questions, partly arising out of the feedback we got from the field trial, and partly because of just using our imaginations. And we were able to then go to the relevant experts on each of those three topics, get feedback that helped us, on the one hand, adjust our approach to for example, aim for dark sky compliant fixtures and maximum color temperature of 3000 Kelvin, but also to have narrative that could then anticipate the sorts of objections people might bring and incorporate that into our report, so that we would basically answer the question before it even got asked. And I think that there are plenty of opportunities to do that in the sorts of business cases that we're presenting.
That's a great answer and summary of that kind of approach. It's interesting. The amateur astronomy thing came up for us too with dark sky lighting, and I mean, one of the most interesting things to me about, we retrofitted all 11,000 streetlights about a year and a half ago through LAS. So put the plug in there. It was an excellent project, and I was astonished. Many of you on the call or in the municipal world will know that the sort of yellow light that came from the old sodium bulbs, and it's it has its charm, but I've also heard it described as sort of sickly and old. We chose a fairly bright white color for the new LEDs that were installed, and it was amazing as we kind of communicated that change. I mean, we did try and undertake some communications around this, and just as you say, obviously there's the dollar savings which speak for themselves, but we did some good photography actually after the new heads had been installed, and showed a bit of before and after in terms of the impact on the public realm, and it's actually quite stark, pardon the pun, in terms of both the impact of the dark sky approach and the brightness in the public realm, and sort of feeling of safety that can come from that. So, as we do these things, maybe with a variable frequency motor, you're not going to be able to talk about those sorts of things as well. But taking the opportunity to sort of explain the broader impact to a resident of the benefits of these kinds of projects is really that opportunity that comes out of something like this. We just have a few minutes left. Alan, I guess I wanted to go back to you to ask, just as we start to wrap up today, pointing people to resources. I know the ministry is always keen to engage with sectors that want to champion conservation demand management. For our attendees here today, after today's webinar, if they're seeking information from the ministry, or if they're seeking those best practices, where would you guide them? And then Alex, I'll come back to you. We can plug the community again, but I'll start with you, Alan.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Well, the ministry does have a toolkit area on the broader public sector reporting portal. In the toolkit, we have a guide on the CDM plan requirement, and there is actually a section of the guide that speaks to the 2019 update. There's a lot of information in terms of the energy reports that have been submitted over the years on open data, and it's also on the portal. So there's those resources within the ministry. We're always looking at developing new ones. So again, we'll be looking at reports and developing benchmarks for at the operation level. So for example, libraries. But beyond that, there is your local distribution company. They have information in terms of what the programs that they offer, their insights into what is doing on your facility. I think the same thing holds true for your gas utility. In addition to Alex's community of practice, the Toronto Region Conservation Authority has a Mayor's Megawatt Challenge group That's another similar organization. I believe that one is a fee for membership, but it is a group that gets together and talks about town hall challenges, or recently they were talking about how to more effectively and efficiently address the requirements around draining pools and using the heat that's in the water. But there's also your own organization, LAS, and they have a number of excellent training programs on the website. One has to do with actually with procurement and cost it out so that you can make a better case to management. Because the building that you're in, it seems like the building is a huge cost, but the ongoing operations of that building dwarfs the cost of the building. So there are lots of really good resources on the LAS site. They involve training at the community level, training trainer, energy literacy. So there are some really good resources at LAS that I strongly urge you to look at.
Alex?
So Jeff, I guess I'd point out that with our community practice, there is the opportunity to, I guess there's two opportunities. One is if you've heard of something as a municipal staffer with a concern for energy management or concern for utility bills, you can go through the archives of questions that have gone back and forth in our community practice and learn what's been said about a particular topic, or you can go ahead and just ask the question. So that's when you are aware of some opportunity and you'd like to kind of go research it a bit. The second opportunity is just to hear what energy managers that are doing involved in similar roles are coming up with. So when there's something new that you may not have even heard about, and I mentioned that cold floodwater for Zambonis as a case in point, that has two benefits. One is that you may have never thought about it, but the other thing is that if you know somebody in a municipality that's implemented it, well, the fact is that ice plant operators are pretty jealous about the way that they run their plant, and they're not going to be particularly interested in upsetting the apple cart because they know what works. If you're able to point people to another municipality where the staff tried something out, they got it to work, and they're enthused about it, and they are ice plant staff, they're not energy wonks like me, that goes a long way to help create a sense of comfort among the people that are actually going to be on the ground dealing with this technology going forward. And so I think that that's a real great benefit that the community practice brings, because it's not just that you're tapping into other energy experts and learning what they've done, you're also learning how they did it, how they made it work in their municipality, and how they got past just not just spreadsheets and calculations, but actually dealing with human beings with a pulse that also have an opinion. And sometimes that opinion is based on experiences where things didn't work out so well compared to what the experts told them was going to result from their work. So if you can learn how it was done and how the message was socialized with the people that are actually have their hands on levers out in the field, then that goes a long way towards success.
Absolutely. It's, I think, invaluable advice to sort of close us off on, because in our experience over the last 5 years, I mean, there are a lot of emerging technologies. There are a lot of companies, both service providers and consulting teams, and those selling the products that may be tempted to oversell in some cases, or where the full impact of the technology has not yet been understood or really assessed. Your community of practice brings that benefit, and I think one of the real strengths that we've got now in Ontario, because Ontario was a relatively early adopter on CDM, I mean, around for many years, but now with 5 years of experience in municipal CDM in a more formalized way and emerging practice, we do have some of that benefit of experience. So hopefully, for those who are on the webinar today and maybe considering additional measures or growing your efforts in CDM, please take advantage of these opportunities. Now, Kathy, I think we have a slide here from AMO on some of the resources that people can access, sample CDM plans, and also the link to the site where this session will be posted. So we'll just get that up on the screen there. And there we are. So a number here of example plans that you can click through to and get a sense of what municipalities of different sizes, everybody from Miscoming Shores to beautiful York Region and a number in between. So with that, we have pretty much reached the point where we have to close off the webinar. I really appreciate everyone's participation, but particularly Alex and Alan, thank you for sharing so much of your experience. I'm sure everybody, I speak for everybody on the webinar when I say how much we appreciate the benefit of that background. And we will, of course, for our Energy Champions again in the near future. So please watch for that. And also please watch for our feedback survey, which will come to you soon and helps AMO with education. So with that, I'll wish everybody a very good day. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again